as long as you follow your own methodology that's been signed off and is fit for purpose, then the UK recycled aggregate market is just as strong as the primary rock quarry market.
Welcome to Breaking Ground. I'm Joe Cage, Head of Customer Success at CheckProof. Today we're talking circularity, what the future of industrial waste recycling really looks like in practice, beyond all the buzzwords. My guest today is Paul Nicholls, CEO of Aggregate Global, engineering-led, operation first, and doing some serious work turning waste into trusted recycled aggregate. Paul, thank you for coming on today.
Hi there, Joe. Thanks for having me on the show today. As you say, my name is Paul Nicholls, Chief Exec and co-founder of Aggregate Global. Happy to be on the show and talk about circularity.
Perfect. So I think if we could just start off, Paul, with who is RIG? What do you do? Just for anyone that's maybe not heard of you.
Yeah, excellent. So there's two key parts, two core elements to RIG. So first and foremost, we're an innovation engineering company providing technological solutions to complex waste problems. We focus on research and development and advancing technology to deal with the most complex of issues around physical, chemical processing and decontamination within soils. The second part of what we do is, we set the company up to be a mergers and acquisitions or a buy and build company to start consolidating assets, within ports, landfills, harbours, quarries in the UK and overseas by, buying them, reimagining them, redesigning them, and then rebuilding them, with modern day technology. With a view then of taking the company forward to a 20 acquisition position within an 8-year period.
So the aim is to try and collate some already existing business, apply your spin on them, and kind of standardize the way of working across.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a core consolidation play. First and foremost, we're a team of scientists and engineers that have worked across multiple industries, whether that's tunnel boring, metalliferous mining. Metalliferous mining is where really the journey started for Aggregate Global. But most notably, we've taken the lessons learned within the metalliferous mining industry, within the tunnel boring industry, within the quarrying, within the waste, and within the marine dredging industry, and we've pulled that together. You tend to see that within these industries they operate in silos, and there's no cross-pollination of that technology. So we brought that technology together to advance waste, mineral, natural resource processing, both in solids and fluids, and then apply that to basically companies across the UK and overseas. The best way to do that in a practical way without disrupting the market is to acquire existing companies and then upgrade those existing companies with our technology.
Okay, so then, because my next question was kind of what problem did you keep seeing in the waste processing industry? And I guess you kind of answered my question there. Was it more there was knowledge that was siloed and wasn't being shared across the different kind of recycling businesses, and you saw a need to do that for the benefit of everyone? Is that the kind of core problem that you saw needed to be fixed, or were there any others that you felt like this could be done better, we can do it better?
Yeah, so I'd probably put it into a couple of different categories. So the first category is around around sustainability, and we've got to look at, let's say, four core waste streams. So we've got to look at metalliferous mining waste, we've got to look at marine dredging, we've got to look at excavation burrow pits, and we've got to look at basically construction demolition arisings. There is technology out there that's been developed in other industries that can take that, that reprocessing, that recycling one step further. The second part to this is operational efficiency. So, some of the technology that was used was a little bit archaic, needed upgrading. And so that kind of operational efficiency then, makes, sustainable aggregates much more economically advantageous, and we can feed that back to the customer. The second or the third part to this is around material science, and it's around understanding, both physical and chemical properties within recycled aggregates, and ensuring that, decontaminated is decontaminated, and then it goes through the correct and robust factory production control procedures, testing and frequency plans, and material quality plans to make sure that recycled aggregate meets the same specifications, if not more rigorous specifications than existing primary rock quarry. The idea is along that journey and along those three steps is to provide a truly sustainable aggregate that works with genuine circularity and a circular economy solution, but it's also reducing embodied carbon. We can reduce embodied carbon by up to 73% in our process. So, the whole point, if we were to summarize it, is sort of, upgrading technology, operational efficiency, basically economically advantageous products that are coming into the market, all while meeting UK relevant standards.
Traditionally, recycled aggregates have maybe not been as trusted as your normal everyday aggregates straight out of the ground. Do you feel like we're at a point now where they can be trusted just as much as recycled aggregates, as raw material aggregates?
So yeah, recycled aggregates, 100% can be trusted. And as long as the company that's putting them out there has a very robust waste acceptance procedure and follows the guidelines set by the Environment Agency and abides by their permits that come in, as long as they, abide by that and are very stringent on what comes in under what waste codes, and then, you look at your factory production control process, so how that material enters into the site, and then what physical and chemical process that material goes through from the point of it, coming across that weigh bridge and entering into the mineral processing facility. As long as you abide by that, and as long as you follow your own methodology that's been signed off and is fit for purpose, then the UK recycled aggregate market is just as strong as the primary rock quarry market. Big things that we need to overcome is more of a psychological position. That's probably the one of the challenging parts. However, the sand that goes in is just as competent, if not more competent, than what comes out of a primary rock quarrying, because the testing regime is much more rigorous than you'd expect to see in a primary rock quarry.
Is there anything that stops recycled aggregates being used in big projects that raw materials would be fine with?
That's a really good question, Joe. So no, there isn't. But we've got to take a step back. Primary rock quarrying plays a pivotal role in the UK's infrastructure. And there are things that recycled aggregates can't do, just by nature of their composition. And so, as an example, you're never going to see a high PSV stone come out of recycled aggregates, and that is critical to the UK's roads and some other concrete products that go out there. And so one must be cognizant of the fact that you really do need that primary stone, and that primary stone still needs to continue throughout the UK. However, recycled aggregates can play a major part in UK infrastructure and the development of UK infrastructure, most notably, around sub-base layers of roads, so those 6F5 products, those Type 1 products that are building up, those big long highways that are going out. They're quite voluminous and do put a lot of strain on primary rock quarries, and it's taking good stone away that has a higher sort of, composition that could be used in much more stringent and regulated areas of road construction, rather than basically just sub-base layers that are starting that road form.
Paul, how would you say you build consistency when the input stream is variable? Are you stricter on what you get given before it goes into the plant, or will you accept if anything, like how does it work at RIG?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's kind of taking it back to the basics. So from a geological point of view, we can be pretty consistent, from what comes out of the ground, because we understand the geology, and what's coming out, from a housing development or from a road construction, so on and so forth. So you've got a good measure on that part. You then kind of generally see the houses, and if we look at the construction demolition and risings waste, you can generally see the houses that have been developed over the years, using the same quarries in and around the Cornwall area, and they'll always be using, whether it's, the house was built 50 years ago, 100 years ago, generally the stone that constructed that house, and is going to be coming from one of those local quarries. Same with the brick, same with the mortar. And so you've got a good handle at the start on that, that chemical composition, that physical composition of the material when it first comes out. But this is where then, once you've got an understanding of how that works, you then enter into your waste acceptance procedure, and you're looking at the particle size distribution of the material coming in, you're looking at the chemical composition of the material coming in, and it has to fit into those waste codes. All of that has checkpoints along that process flow, and that allows us then to be extremely consistent off the back end. The final part of that is the testing and the frequency plan.
Maybe this is a question more for new customers that haven't used recycled aggregates as much, but do they demand more information before they start using the material?
So it depends. It depends on who's procuring the material, whether it's a primary rock quarry or whether it's a recycled aggregate producer. We all have to operate under the same framework and the same standards, whether that's the specification for highways works or any BS standards for product design. We still have to hit those criteria to be able to carry a certificate and say, hey, our product is here ready to enter into the UK market. So it doesn't matter whether you're the smallest customer or whether you're a tier one contractor, everyone gets the same product with the same level of testing. Psychologically, somewhere in the middle of those two, the tier ones and the and the smaller, the smaller sort of own your own house and want a ton dumpy bag delivered, you do get some people that you need to take on a journey, and you need to explain a bit about how we take the material in, how we process it, and how we how we turn it into something that is just as good as a primary rock quarry. But that's part of the process and that's part of the fun. And it's something that we are always very keen to do, is invite people in and show them a more sustainable way of managing our natural resources.
Do you think that the industry needs this kind of nutrition label, but for recycled aggregates, so they, or is it something that you already do already?
Yes, there's definitely, and at Recycling Global, we're always advancing everything that we can do. Currently working with the government's UK ETS scheme for carbon credit trading, and we're pushing now with our EPD, so our environmental product declaration sheets, which and it's something very similar to what you're asking for there, and it gives some real tangible data on every single part, every single touch point from that material entering into our site, into the physical, and chemical process that it goes through, and to the point of it leaving the site and entering into, the final resting place of the end user. And that will always continue. There'll always be good work being done around this to advance both product designs and the product data that we can put out there.
What would you say is the fastest way that someone would lose trust in a recycled aggregate?
So there's a couple of things. So material quality is always going to be the biggest thing. And that's the same whether you're recycled recycled aggregate producer, whether you're a primary rock aggregate producer. Other things that can affect the product, and sometimes isn't always the operator's fault. And this is whether it's a primary rock quarry or a recycled aggregate. Is the weather. We're certainly in the southwest of the UK, and in our sites in the southwest of the UK, we've experienced some of the highest rainfall that's been ever seen on record, and so that certainly dampens both the mood and the quality of the product due to moisture content. So you're ever battling with those things. I would say that we've got a really robust customer journey, and customer feedback process to make sure that we're always capturing those concerns, and make sure that we meet the demands of the end user.
If we were to move on to logistics, obviously recycling has kind of an extra step compared to your average quarry. The material's there, and it gets extracted there. When it comes to recycling, it has to be brought in, but by road, I assume, for the most part. How do you kind of, when it comes to a carbon kind of standpoint, how do you make sure that you win on the kind of carbon data points when you've got that extra step of having to get material brought in to process it, to take it out?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a good point. And so what are the key factors of this? If we go back to what we discussed, what is RIG? So RIG is an acquisitions company. We buy businesses, we consolidate, and the aspiration is to acquire 20 businesses in the next 8 years, which we're already ahead of the game on. But it comes down to the strategic part of that and buying those companies that are well positioned to service the economic needs, the economic development and growth within the areas that they are located. And what that does then is it allows us to be in the locations where we know that there's going to be economic growth over the next sort of 20 to 30 years.
Looking towards the future, then, what policy or kind of commercial shift will kind of accelerate circular materials the most in the next 2 to 3 years?
There's definitely a want, need, and desire within the industry to do better, particularly around natural resources. As a global entity, we consume 50 billion tons of sand a year globally, and that's set to rise every year. And so we have to do better with our natural resources. We have to plan better, and we have to become more sustainable in the way that we act. But the economic drivers of this is predominantly down to landfill tax, and so we're seeing this step change now in both the rise of the inert landfill tax rate that's going up and up each year, and both the hazardous landfill tax rate, which is hovering just above £126 a ton at the moment. And so if you look at depositing your material, whether it's inert or whether it's hazardous, you're paying the cost of the tipping, the transport, and essentially, the fee that you'll pay the landfill operator. And we're going to see the gap close between basically the inert landfill rate and hazardous landfill rates, and that is going to put an unsustainable amount of pressure on construction companies to from an economic standpoint to continue without looking and sourcing sustainable products or sustainable methods of tipping. On the back end of that, so we talked about obviously the import and obviously, well, when you tip with companies like RIG, you're not paying the landfill tax, so economically people are driven towards us as a tipping solution. And like I say, reducing things by 73% in embodied carbon is a huge tick box exercise for all major contractors out there. So there's many factors into it, but I would say the economics are the big driving force.
Has there been any kind of lessons learned the hard way when it comes to changing behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, there's many, we never stop learning. And anyone that sits there and says that they know everything, is rather arrogant and is going to struggle in life to find peace. And we enjoy the process of having new challenges presented to us at each stage, whether that's, during the start of the journey. And we develop these 4 key pillars. So I developed the pillar 1 is essentially the research or the feasibility phase. So that could be the feasibility of acquiring a company. That could be the feasibility and due diligence of designing a particular mineral processing facility for that location, or it could be a combination of the two. And along that part, we've taken the lessons learned from the previous part, the mistakes that we've made, and we've applied that to pillar 1. We then transition to pillar 2, Pillar 2 is essentially the acquisition of whatever we've just done the feasibility on, and the construction of the mineral processing facility and the redesign, the redevelopment of the site, and then subsequently the commissioning of that plant. Again, the lessons learned that we took from the previous construction and the previous commissioning of a processing facility, we take into Pillar 2 of the next acquisition. That leads into Pillar 3, which is we own and operate each of the businesses that we acquire. So they're just added to the portfolio of companies. And then the management team that we put in each subsidiary of the group is then trained on the mistakes made from the past. And then Pillar 4 is the most exciting pillar. So that's the research and development. As we say, we're a team of scientists and engineers that are always innovating and providing technological solutions to complex waste problems. And there's lots of touch points and things that we learn along that journey. But what we found is by sticking to those 4 key pillars and taking the lessons learned, taking those failures that we've had in the past, and then applying them to every acquisition that we have in the future, we can maintain a fairly steady state level of control on that. But hey, things always pop up, and we can deal with those as they come on.
There's always something new that you don't expect that you need to handle, but that's, I guess, part of the fun of what you do. And then to finish off, is there anything that you're watching closely in 2026?
Yeah, I think I think all of us, particularly within the natural resources space, are all keen to see what the UK government does, particularly around the construction sector. British infrastructure is the backbone of the UK's economy, so we need to make sure that that's properly invested and properly supported by the government. Things that don't help that at the moment, there's obviously the political position and the conflicts that we're seeing around the world. They do have a material effect on what we do, particularly with say fuel prices, which we're seeing going up and up at the moment. And so I think things that we're going to watch is what is the government going to do to boost the construction sector and give the housing a real kickstart. We've got to build 3.5 million homes to facilitate the UK demand. UK infrastructure is tired and it needs upgrading. We also want to see a step change in the regulatory framework to allow housing and infrastructure projects to come forward in a much more speedy way, which seems to be the blocker to most things. But also looking at those economics, those fuel and bits that we're seeing through conflicts around the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, Paul. It's been really insightful for me. Recycling, that kind of side of the industry is something that I felt like I haven't really had much insight on. It's something I've been around and involved with ever so slightly, but I've had nowhere near as much detail from anywhere else to give an insight into the industry. So thanks so much for coming in and talking with me today.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Joe. It's been a pleasure to come on board and chat with you today. That's been great.
Yeah, thank you. So everyone that's listening, if you want to keep up to date with Breaking Ground, you can listen to us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in to past and future episodes there, and we'll catch you next time.